New York, 1898. After a hard week's work, you're heading to a bar with your friend. You read the papers, Joe? What the Spanish are doing in Cuba is barbaric. Their rebels are just like our patriots in the American Revolution. We need to help them. This again, you sigh? Look, it's not our responsibility. President McKinley's got it right. We should stay out of it. McKinley, he scoffs. That fool? Did you hear what Teddy Roosevelt said about him? Oh, the backbone of an eclair. Well, maybe Teddy should go and conquer Cuba on his own then. Finally, you spot the bar. After a few drinks, you can start talking baseball, and not about Spain or Cuba. Then you spot a newsboy selling the New York Journal. Extra, extra! U.S. naval ship Maine, sunk by the Spanish. Many of our boys dead in the water. We had the designs of the enemy's infernal machine that killed our sailors. Shocked, you quickly buy a paper. This can't be true, can it? You look in horror at the artist's impression of the Maine blowing up, and the news that the ship's sinking is being celebrated in Madrid. Joe pipes up. I told you, if we didn't do something about Cuba, then those Spaniards were capable of anything. You try to remain open-minded, but you can feel the anger rising in your gut. If this really was a Spanish attack, then God help them. The full fury of the United States will descend upon their empire. I'm your host, James Barton, and this is Forgotten Wars.
Consequently, this country is at war with Germany.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
First few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada.
Happy New Year, everyone. As we enter 2025, there are going to be a few changes with the podcast. I have a new mic, which I'm using today, so the sound quality should be better. Also, this will be my first mini-series, something I'm going to do a lot more in the future. Now, let's get into the good stuff. The Spanish-American War, in my opinion, is one of the most misunderstood wars in American history. When I was at university, it was basically described as an easy American victory that finally woke up the world to American power, after decades of industrialization since the Civil War. It was the beginning of American empire and world power. Yet popular history has really simplified why it started, covered up how close the invasion of Cuba actually came to disaster, and often overlooks how divided opinion was over the war. In this multi-part series, we're going to do a deep dive into this fascinating conflict. Cuba is the largest island in the Caribbean and is only 19 miles away from Key West in Florida. It was one of the first islands in the New World discovered by Columbus and had been under Spanish rule for over 300 years. The Spanish Empire had declined dramatically by the late 19th century, but Cuba was the jewel in Spain's crown. It had a prosperous economy based on sugarcane, rum and tobacco, while its wealth was the only reason the Spanish budget could be balanced. It was also a potent reminder of the previous glory of the Spanish Golden Age. Since the American Revolution, there had been a general feeling among the American political class that Cuba would one day join the US. Thomas Jefferson, 1820, claimed, "Cuba is the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our system of states," and told Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, that the United States ought, at the first possible opportunity, to take Cuba. While the annexation of Cuba was considered desirable, maybe even inevitable, nothing was really done about it until the 1840s. As America was increasingly torn apart by the division over slavery, the South began looking for potential territories America could conquer, and then add them to the Union as slave states, bolstering their power against the anti-slavery North. Cuba already had 500,000 slaves and a prosperous plantation economy. It seemed a perfect fit for the South's needs. In the late 1840s, President Polk, a slave owner himself and the only president to buy and sell slaves from the White House. It was a hobby that relaxed him, apparently. Lovely man. Dispatched a minister, the term for ambassadors in this period, to Spain, with the mission of buying Cuba for $100 million. He picked as his minister the marvellously named Romulus Mitchell Saunders. His bizarre name, however, was the only thing that he brought to this mission. He couldn't speak Spanish, while future President James Buchanan noted that even English he sometimes murders. His negotiations with the Spanish went terribly, with his mixture of hysterics, threats, and obvious bribery attempts annoying the Spanish, who told him they would prefer seeing Cuba sunk in the ocean rather than sold. To top off his failure, this was meant to have been a secret mission, yet Saunders had managed to tell virtually everyone that he encountered about his mission before he even left the United States, including a mystified saloon owner where he got blackout drunk. Inevitably, word got back to the anti-slavery side, and the resulting scandal meant that even if Spain had agreed, Polk wouldn't have been able to buy Cuba anyway. The next attempt to annex Cuba for America was the Lopez expedition. Narciso Lopez was a freebooter, basically a mercenary, who had previously fought for the Spanish, but now saw there was dollars to be made in expanding US territory. He travelled the South recruiting men for an expedition to Cuba, playing up the expansion of slavery territory angle to his eager audience. He almost persuaded Jefferson Davis, future President of the Confederacy, to join him, but a wifely veto intervened. A similar thing happened with future Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who was heavily in debt at the time and was looking for a way out. In the end, he recruited only 40 men, while his sole success in Cuba was burning down the governor's mansion before having to flee back to the United States with the Spanish in hot pursuit. The South wasn't done, though. A not-so-secret society had been formed called the Knights of the Golden Circle. Their aim was to take over most of the Caribbean and the lands in South America that bordered it, a tropical empire of slavery that would guarantee sudden power over the North. Once again, they tried to persuade America to buy Cuba. However, loose talk by some of their members outraged anti-slavery activists, and their dream died. You would think after Romulus Mitchell Saunders they would learn to keep their mouths shut by now. After the American Civil War, regular revolts began to rack Cuba as Spanish power declined. These gained public sympathy in the US, and weapons smuggling to Cuban rebels became a regular thing that was winked at by the authorities in Washington. However, successive presidents did not want another war so soon after the devastation of the Civil War, so the Cuban revolts were all snuffed out by the Spanish. This was until Cuba's Second War of Independence began in 1895. This one would be very different, a game-changer. Started by the Cuban poet José Martí, though he had been killed in an ambush early on, it had rapidly gained steam. Soon, 150,000 Spanish troops were battling a force of 30,000 rebels, conducting ambushes and raids before fleeing back into the jungles of Cuba. The war was going badly for Spain as thousands of its troops died, mostly from tropical diseases, that age-old problem of Europeans fighting in the Caribbean, that we also saw in our episode on the Haitian Revolution. To try and turn the tide, Spain sent the formidable General Valeriano Huela to finally break the back of the insurgency. His solution was a brutal one that would go down in history, to be copied by many governments and armies fighting insurgencies. Cuban peasants were forcibly moved from their homes and sent to army-maintained outposts, known as concentration camps. That's right, Spain has the dubious distinction of inventing and naming the modern concentration camp. By 1898, a third of the Cuban population had been moved into camps, where at least 170,000 had died from disease and neglect. Far from defeating the insurgency, it only drove more Cubans to join the rebels, and the war became even more violent. Picture this in your mind's eye. You are a young Cuban peasant in 1896, and your life is about to be changed forever. Your village is poor, and outsiders are rare, despite the war that rages around you. Yet now that war has finally come home. Out of the jungle came the Spanish soldiers, yelling for everyone to come outside. Currently they are smashing their way into your humble homes. One emerges dragging out a screaming woman by her hair. Then an officer arrives on a magnificent horse with a fancy uniform. He stares at you all with undisguised disdain. "We come in the name of His Majesty Don Alfonso. There is rebel activity in this area, and His Majesty's troops have been attacked. On the orders of His Excellency General Weyler, you will abandon this village and be moved to a secure location. Any resistance and you will be hanged as a rebel." At bayonet point, the soldiers start moving you. One has a flaming torch and starts to set fire to your homes. You stare hatefully at the Spanish troops. One notices and slaps you in the face. You try to leap at him, but your mother holds you back. "Listen to your mother, boy, or you'll face the rope," shouts the Spanish soldier. Suddenly a gunshot comes out of the bush, and the soldier clutches his chest as he falls to the floor. More gunshots ring out as more Spaniards fall. "Rebels!" shouts the officer. "Return fire!" Chaos breaks out as the villagers flee and the Spanish troops battle the rebels. Your mother grabs your hand and you flee into the jungle. You keep running until the sounds of gunfire can no longer be heard. As you catch your breath, you make a promise to join the rebels after your mother is safe. For his crimes, a new name will be coined for General Weyler: Butcher Weyler. This war of concentration camps, atrocity and counter-atrocity, on an island so close to the United States, would soon become a running sore in American politics. It would inspire ambition, fear, greed, and idealism in almost equal measure. To understand how America would end up at war with Spain, we must understand the circumstances both countries found themselves in during the last years of the 19th century. Historians love using the phrase, "it was a period of transition," so much that it's become a bit hackneyed, but it's a great way to describe America as it prepared to enter the 20th century. After the Civil War, its economy had grown dramatically. It transformed into an industrial superpower that had even overtaken Britain. Already scare stories were appearing in the European newspapers about the economic colossus across the Atlantic Ocean. Yet despite American economic success, the home front was not peaceful. It was a land still divided by the legacy of the Civil War. Elections could still be won by Republicans waving the bloody shirt, reminding voters of Southern treachery and calling on them to avenge the blood shed by Union soldiers, while the Democrats had a virtual monopoly on the southern states of the former Confederacy, playing on memories of rampaging Union armies. Some of the idealism of the Civil War in liberating the slaves remained, yet segregation was being imposed on African Americans at the same time. In fact, the US Supreme Court just declared segregation legal in the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson case in 1896. While America was joining the ranks of the great powers, it was also joining at a time of intense empire building and international rivalry. While European powers such as Britain, France and Spain had been colonial powers for centuries by now, in this last couple of decades before World War I, the remaining territories of the world were divided up and new nations got in on the act. Newly unified nations such as Germany and Italy sought empires, while an industrialized Japan also looked for conquest overseas. Having an empire had become almost a status symbol of being a great power, a badge to join the club, so to speak. Among America's elite, this had not gone unnoticed. Spain was deeply divided even before the crisis arose. Its king had abdicated in 1873. A brief republic followed, which was ended by a series of coups, eventually leading to a constitutional monarchy. During the Cuban crisis, a boy too young to rule is on the throne. His mother, the Queen Regent, has little power and is at the mercy of the various cliques fighting for power. Spanish politics during this time is a blood sport, and with lots of corruption thrown in. A relatively liberal faction currently ruled the country, but they were very vulnerable to the charge of being soft on the Cuban rebels and not protecting Spanish interests. The Spanish liberals knew they couldn't win a war with America, but if they were too obliging to the US, they will fall from power. They were caught in a bind, trying to walk a tightrope that is becoming increasingly precarious. Now we've set our scene, it's time to meet the two key figures in our drama. We'll start with Republican President William McKinley. He's hard to classify as a president. There is a Sphinx-like quality to him. Every individual can see in him what they want to see. If you look at his accomplishments, he seems quite a consequential president. Victory in the Spanish-American War, building an American empire. Yet, most of these achievements are often credited to others, and it's very easy to portray him as being carried along by the tide of events. Even in his official photos, he appears stalwart and determined, yet there is a blank look in his eyes, so you feel you never really know who he is. I'll put up some photos on our Facebook group and in the YouTube video so you can see what I'm talking about. The last president to have served in the Civil War, he was reluctant to fight another war and would act as a brake on his more aggressive colleagues. The other figure in our drama was the far more colourful Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. Already something of a star at this time, he was legendary for his strong build, spectacles, bushy moustache, and flashes of brilliantly white teeth. A force of nature the likes of which American politics has rarely seen. He had already lived a life more adventurous and filled with achievements than most people would achieve in their lifetime. From a family that was practically American aristocracy, he was not wealthy himself. He was also something of a Renaissance man, a famous writer in his day, explorer, a keen hunter who also loved nature and championed preserving America's natural heritage. A blue blood who had bought and run a ranch in the Old West, earning the respect of hardened cowboys in the process. Fun fact, teddy bears are named after him, due to a story about Roosevelt not shooting a cute bear cub during a hunting trip. Full disclosure, he is my favourite president, but I would not be giving him an easy ride in this series. As the war in Cuba raged on, he was serving in McKinley's cabinet as Assistant Secretary for the Navy. This is not normally an influential position, but by sheer force of personality, Roosevelt was leveraging it to become a major force in the administration. He would become the most ardent expansionist in the McKinley cabinet. Interestingly, even foreign governments such as the British were worried about him, particularly about Cuba. At the exclusive Metropolitan Club, he formed a brain trust of senators, congressmen, military officers, writers and lawyers, united in the belief that America must free Cuba, annex Hawaii, and step up as a great power. This was a very influential lobby group and would play a major role in the upcoming drama. Just to give you an example, Commodore George Dewey was an early member, a man who will play a major role in the Pacific Theatre and conquest of the Philippines in the upcoming war. While Roosevelt and his brain trust were working on the elites, another force was rousing the average American against Spanish rule in Cuba. The infamous yellow journalism. Joseph Pulitzer, he of the famous Pulitzer Prize in Journalism, had started this trend when he bought the New York World. Focusing heavily on sensationalized stories on crime and corruption, it had quickly become the best-selling newspaper in New York. Inspired by the path Pulitzer had blazed, mining heir William Randolph Hearst bought the New York Journal as part of his newspaper empire, copying the same formula of sensationalized stories. For my British listeners, they were basically the same as the Sun newspaper. Soon, these two rivals were in a bitter circulation war, battling for the crown of the most read newspaper in New York. Hearst even lured away the cartoonists behind Pulitzer's popular Yellow Kid cartoon strip, which earned both papers the title of Yellow Journalism. Their chosen field of battle would be atrocity stories from Spanish Cuba. The gorier and more horrific, the better. Let's take a visit to New York to see this rivalry in action. As you walk down a New York street, you see two newsboys representing the rival newspapers of Pulitzer and Hearst. Which one to buy, you think? Both are always fascinating to read. Read all about it. Latest massacre by Spanish troops in Cuba, only in the New York World. Immediately, the boy selling the rival New York Journal pipes up. That's nothing. We have exclusive coverage of Butcher Whaler's torture of Cuban freedom fighters and how he drinks the blood of his victims. Only in the New York Journal. Caught up in their rivalry, the horror stories come thick and fast. Spanish soldiers strip search an American woman in latest outrage. Butcher Whaler threatens the United States. Keep out, or else. Spanish army marches into battle with babies on pikes. Spanish rule in Cuba is truly monstrous, you think, as you finally pick the New York Journal and toss the money to the newsboy. It's good to see some things never change when it comes to the press. These are all actual stories from the period. Whether due to yellow journalism or not, the steady stream of atrocity stories was outraging the American public. There was increasing pressure on McKinley to do something, anything, about it. In the interest of fairness, the Spanish press wasn't any better. One notorious article in a Barcelona newspaper claimed, "The average height among the Americans is 5 foot 2 inches. This is due to their living almost entirely upon vegetables, as they ship all their beef out of the country, so eager are they to make money. There is no doubt that one full-grown Spaniard can defeat any free men in America." Certainly fighting talk there. 12 days into 1898, and a small riot broke out in Havana. Shortly after, Captain Charles Sigsbee of the USS Maine received a cryptic cable saying only 2 words. $2. It was a secret code meaning steam for Cuba immediately. The Maine arrived in Havana Harbour for a friendly visit. At first, everything seemed peaceful and the mission uneventful. That was soon to change. As the Maine lay anchored in Havana Bay, another scandal erupted that would further inflame tensions. Hearst's New York Journal published a sensational exclusive on its front page, supposedly the worst insult to the United States in its history. Cuban rebels had intercepted a letter from the Spanish minister to the United States, Enrique de Lome, to a friend in Cuba. In it, he famously claimed that McKinley is weak and a bidder for the admiration of the crowd. Besides, being a would-be politician who tries to leave a door open behind himself while keeping on good terms with the jingos of his party. While many in America, including Teddy, had said far worse about McKinley, insults from a foreign power riled up American society and fueled further anti-Spanish sentiment. In true tabloid style, the New York Journal ran a "Go Home, De Lome" campaign to force his return to Spain. While De Lome's crude insults were focused on by the press, it was another part of the letter that truly shocked the policymakers in the McKinley administration. In the final paragraph, De Lome concluded that it would be very advantageous to take up if only for effect, the question of foreign relations, and to have a man of some prominence sent here in order that I may make use of him to carry on a propaganda among the senators and others in opposition to the rebel junta. In other words, the Spanish government appeared to be lying that they too wanted a peaceful solution to the Cuban conflict, probably involving some measure of autonomy for the island. As the critical moment of the crisis arrived, any belief in Spanish good faith had been dealt a severe blow. The manner of Delorme's departure added further insult to injury. He left before the State Department could demand he be recalled, while the Spanish apology was highly sarcastic, blaming mail theft and sensation-mongering newspapers. To be fair, they weren't wrong, but it was the wrong response in such a charged atmosphere. An agitated Teddy at a social event went on a tirade about how American honour must be redeemed by invading Cuba. Perhaps caught up in his own rhetoric, he then announced that, "I hope to see the Spanish flag and the English flag gone from the map of North America before I'm 60. Marcus Hanna, influential senator and the mastermind behind McKinley's election, looked at him aghast and shouted, "You're crazy, Roosevelt. What's wrong with Canada?" It's interesting that someone who was against a war with Spain was already discounting Cuba at this time. Now we turn to the USS Maine in its final moments. Let's imagine we are flies on the wall. The air is hot and motionless as the Maine gently rocks in Havana Harbour. As darkness falls, the nightlife begins in Havana. The residents, now used to the sight of the US warship, more concerned with drinking, dancing, and romance. Across the water, music starts coming from the Maine, the sound of a bugler blowing taps. Its beauty causes Captain Sigsbee, writing in his cabin, to lay down his pen and listen until the last echoes died away. He'd been worried when ordered to Havana, but so far everything has been calm. Hopefully there'll be a peaceful solution to this crisis. He looks at his watch. The time is exactly 9:40 p.m. Urgent telegram. Maine blown up in Havana Harbor at 9:40 tonight and destroyed. End stop. Many wounded. Doubtless more killed and drowned. In the White House, McKinley paced back and forth, mumbling to himself, "The Maine blown up. The Maine blown up." Upon hearing the news, Teddy proclaimed, "The Maine was sunk by an act of dirty treachery on the part of the Spanish, I believe." By dawn, the tragedy of the Maine had hit the headlines of the morning editions across the United States, Hearst remarking, "This means war, boys," as he briefed his news team. An explosion had taken place somewhere in the front of the Maine, killing 258 men instantly. A further 8 were so badly crushed and burned that they died one by one in hospitals ashore. The eventual death toll was 266. The burnt remains of the ship were now at the bottom of Havana Harbour, only a few blackened parts showing above the waterline. Public opinion about the sinking was subdued at first. There was a widespread assumption it may have been an internal accident. There had been previous explosions on similar ships where gunpowder stores had been ignited by a spontaneous fire in the coal bunker. The coal used in the Maine was bituminous, which is known for releasing fire damp, a mixture of gases composed primarily of flammable methane that is prone to spontaneous explosions. There were plenty of electrical wires around where the explosion took place to provide a spark to ignite the gas. McKinley was still desperate to avoid a war. He lamented to a friend that, "I have been through one war. I have seen the dead piled up, and I do not want to see another." He set up a board of inquiry to investigate why the Maine had sunk, hoping it would not blame the Spanish. Others, however, were quite happy to blame the Spanish. Here we've reached a dramatisation at the start of this podcast. The yellow press leapt straight to a conclusion of Spanish responsibility, with Hearst's New York Journal alleging a secret infernal machine had blown up the Maine. Artists produced elaborate drawings of the machine and the explosion on the Maine. The day before the opening of the official inquiry, the journal published no fewer than 8 pages of supposedly conclusive data, some so detailed that even Captain Sigsbee wondered if the paper had secret contacts with the saboteurs. Sales of the paper reached an unprecedented 1 million that morning. Not to be outdone, Pulitzer sent a tugboat to Cuba filled with journalists and experts to report on the truth. In just a week, the World had sold 5 million copies, the largest circulation of any newspaper in the world. As the inquiry droned on, the public became increasingly impatient. Passions started to rise, and a war looked more and more likely. In an atmosphere of mounting tension, as the Court of Inquiry continued to delay over its verdict, a senator you rarely hear about in many accounts of this war stood to speak about his recent visit to Cuba. Redfield Proctor was a highly respected senator with strong connections in politics and big business. Think of him as a true establishment figure. He had been relatively neutral in the debates over Cuba so far, yet the speech he was about to give would act as a tipping point for the American intervention in Cuba. Proctor confessed he'd gone to Cuba an isolationist, yet had returned thinking intervention was inevitable. Over several hours he condemned the concentration camps where peasants were living like pigs and dying like flies. Spain, he declared, would never give Cuba autonomy, and Cubans would never stop fighting for it. His conclusion, delivered in a coldly professional voice, all the more powerful for all the heated rhetoric over Cuba, was such: "To me, the strongest appeal is not the barbarity practiced by Whaler, nor the loss of the Maine, but the spectacle of 1.5 million people, the entire native population of Cuba, struggling for freedom and deliverance from the worst misgovernment of which I ever had knowledge." This speech is often dismissed, yet after this the Senate turned decisively for war. Big business and Wall Street, previously unanimously against intervention, now swung behind it. Maybe most disturbing for the Republican McKinley was that the Democrats now began to take up the cause of Cuba Libre. Perennial Democratic presidential nominee William Jennings Bryan started flying the Cuban rebel flag at his rallies. Political observers predicted that unless McKinley intervened, the Republicans were facing a rout to the Democrats. As the Chicago Times-Herald said, "Who can doubt that by that sign they will sweep the country?" The focus was now on McKinley. He did not want war, but the pressure from the public, from business, and now politically as well, was becoming unbearable. In fact, at this time, he had banned Teddy from meetings as he couldn't take the endless rants that America must invade Cuba. Poor man. Then the inquiry announced its conclusion. The Maine had been sunk by the Spanish. McKinley was a realist, and knew now that war was inevitable. Just for the record, it's still most likely that the Maine was actually sunk by an internal explosion, an accident. However, with the passions of the time, I don't think the inquiry would have come to any other conclusion than Spanish involvement. On the 26th of March, Roosevelt publicly confronted Senator Hanna, one of the last holdouts for peace, at a Gridiron Club after-dinner speech which electrified the Capitol. "Let's head there now. You are a young upcoming journalist, an admirer of Teddy Roosevelt, and you've been tipped off that his latest speech will be a barn burner. You wait with bated breath as he begins. He launches into his usual attacks on Spain, blaming the Maine's destruction on them, going over their many atrocities in Cuba. You can see Senator Hanna getting angrier and angrier. Teddy smacks his fist, proclaiming that, 'We will have this war for the freedom of Cuba.' Then he turns and stares directly at Hannah. The interests of the business world and of financiers might be paramount in the Senate, but they were not so with the American people. Anyone who wanted to stand in the way of popular opinion was welcome to try the experiment. The fat and jowly Hannah's face turns purple, and his knuckles turn white as he grips the arms of his chair. He splutters in outrage. To you, there is no greater comparison than this ignoble political fixer of the past, and Teddy, who represents the future greatness of America. As you leave the dinner, a hand grabs your arm. You look up, and it is Senator Hannah. I have fought in a war. I have seen what it does. It's not the glorious thing Mr. Roosevelt portrays it as. As he leaves, you briefly wonder about his words, but then dismiss them. Cuba will be free. Even at this late stage, McKinley remained conflicted over the war. He had written his request for Congress to declare war, but delayed sending it after Spain hinted at further concessions. When these didn't materialize, he delayed again to allow Americans to evacuate from Cuba. Legislators became so frustrated that they stormed into the White House to confront McKinley, forcing the president to lock the declaration of war in a safe. One senator growled that, "By God, don't your president know where the war-declaring power is lodged?" Roosevelt once again quipped that McKinley had no more backbone than a chocolate eclair. Finally, McKinley could delay no longer. "I have exhausted every effort to relieve the intolerable condition of affairs which is at our doors," he told Congress. "I am prepared to execute every obligation imposed upon me by the Constitution and the law. I await your action." America was going to war. Teddy, however, would not be staying behind a desk. Despite pleas by his colleagues in the press to stay at his post, he would instead be serving as a volunteer officer in the army that would invade Cuba. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, leave a rating, or tell a friend. See you next time for part 2 as America invades Cuba. Victories will be won, harsh lessons learned, and legends will be born.